So 9-3 is one of my favorite sections because if you've ever sat back in American history and thought, man, you know what this needs? Pirates. Well, this is your section, friends. You will see here an image of a pirate. This is one of the pirates of the Barbary States, and we're going to talk today about how Jefferson took them on. So take a look at your objective, which is to understand and explain key military events of Jefferson's presidency. In the last few sections, we've done more domestic and political events, like his dismantling was a good word, dismantling or shrinking the size of the federal government, but then drastically increasing the size of the actual country via the Louisiana Purchase. So now we're going to look at the military events, including pirates. Okay. Here's 3 specific conflicts that you're going to talk about today. These are the 3 you need to be aware of. We've got 2 international conflicts. Like I said, we're going to have a conflict in the Mediterranean with some pirates, and we are going to handle it way more bravely than Europe does, if that makes you happy. We're going to continue to be embroiled, in the conflict between Great Britain and France. And then we're going to have, again, unsurprisingly, more domestic conflict with Native Americans. You should have been able to infer that this would happen as soon as we decided that we had purchased a huge area of land on which people already lived. And you're going to be introduced to 2 people named Tecumseh and the Prophet. So we'll start with those pirates, because you got to start with the best part. These are the Barbary States. I need you to know that. I need you to know which continent the Barbary States are on and which sea they border. So if you don't know that this is Africa or North Africa, and you don't know that this is the Mediterranean Sea, that's something you're going to want to write down. So these are what we call the Barbary States. They're actually called the Berber States. These are the 4. I don't expect you to know any of them except Tripoli. I'll ask you to remember, but this is where they were, and they basically made a living. They were slave traders, but they also made a living off of capturing ships and holding them for ransom or selling what they had gotten. And they were quite good at what they did, which is how they managed to make a living off of it for so long. They'd been doing this to European ships because, as you can imagine, any of these European powers need to sail the Mediterranean in order to head to the Atlantic Ocean for trade. So they originally were raiding European ships, but as American trade increases exponentially, they also then start doing it to American ships. Now, what the Europeans did was they paid something called tribute. And tribute, you learned about this first in 6th grade. This is money that you pay to a larger or at least more dangerous power for protection. You pay them this money and they don't kill you. Now, if you lived in like a gang city or a mob city, you would understand this is protection racket, that you demand money in return for not hurting somebody. This is the same thing that the mob does. So that's what the Europeans had done. They found that it was more cost effective, since they were kind of busy just fighting each other. They found it was more cost effective to pay this tribute. Jefferson also, I should mention, paid tribute for a while, but ultimately Jefferson decides that this is not the American way. Please remember the XYZ affair and their slogan at that time, millions for defense, but not 1 6 for tribute. You know that Americans don't like this. So he's going to send warships, including the USS Philadelphia, which you'll see on the next slide. And their purpose, those warships, is going to be to protect American merchant vessels or trading vessels. Please remember that as a result of the XYZ affair, one of the things John Adams did was to build up the American Navy. Now, you should remember that Jefferson tried to shrink the military along with shrinking all the parts of the government, but that was one of the things that Adams did. So like I said, it doesn't go super well. Here's an American warship burning. That's the Philadelphia. We'll get to that in a second. As usual, in America's first encounter with this power, they don't do terribly well. But in the end, they send who else? The Marines. So in 1805, the Marines do one of their most infamous and famous missions. They march all the way across the Sahara Desert. They're kind of a big deal. 600 miles, and they capture the capital of Tripoli. So here's Tripoli. The American Marines are going to march across the Sahara Desert. They're going to capture Tripoli, and they're going to not completely end the threat, but end a big part of the threat that we're facing from the Barbary States. Like I said, this is the USS Philadelphia. This is Stephen Decatur. He's part of your Quizlet set. He was a leader. His most important thing that I want you to learn about him is when the USS Philadelphia was captured by the Barbary States and by Tripoli, Stephen Decatur wasn't going to take that lying down. He had the attitude, if I can't have you, no one can. So he led a force that took the area where the ship was being held and burned it so that the pirates couldn't have it, which in my definition is awesome. This is the Marines hymn. The reason I mention this is because, as you can see, even in that second line of the Marines hymn, there's a mention of that epic battle that they fought at Tripoli and how important that was in the early stages of the American founding. Now, on to Britain and France. This is an amazing picture. This is what happens when you Google neutrality. I want you to see this. I want you to imagine America as this little gummy bear here. And then, of course, being menaced on both sides, we have Great Britain and France. They're at war again. And the U.S. again tries to adopt that policy that Washington advised of neutrality. I mean, that makes sense because if you stay neutral, I always compare this to you and your two friends. If you stay neutral, you can stay friends with both of them. Now, you're not probably trying to trade and make money off of both your friends, but that's what the United States is trying to do. They're trying to trade with both sides. But Great Britain and France don't care what we want. They want to hurt their enemy. So they decide if you're going to continue to be neutral, even in the face of us requesting both Britain, obviously we have the Jay Treaty with, so we've established peace with them, and France on the other side can reasonably expect that we'll help them in this war since they helped us in our war with Great Britain. But as you know, we're not going to do that. So both sides are going to start attacking and seizing American trading ships, and the British especially are going to continue impressment, which, as you recall, the Jay Treaty tried to fix, but the British never agreed that they would stop it. In case you were wondering, yes, we're going to have to go to war to end this, and that's what's going to happen in the next section. There's two iconic images of impressment. That first one is the one I showed you of the guy being like hogtied. That's my favorite one. But you also have this one where they're being forced at gunpoint onto the British ship to serve in the British Navy. For neutrality, just keep thinking back to when you have two friends, they both want you to get involved. They will say like, well, can you believe she did this? And you'll be like, please leave me alone. And that's the attitude that America had in this case. So Jefferson comes up with a not so brilliant idea. Now, in his defense, he probably thought it was a brilliant idea, but it was an epic failure. And that was what we call the Embargo Act of 1807. So you definitely need to know what an embargo is. He made this decision. And again, we're back to this idea of, well, then no one can trade with us. This is really like you deciding, okay, my two friends keep trying to get me involved. I'm going to stop being friends with either of them and they'll come crawling back. So this is what Jefferson, was hoping would happen. He said, okay, I'm going to make a government order that forbids us to trade with anyone. But unfortunately, the biggest loser, oh man, I meant to pull the biggest loser icon from the show, but whatever. The biggest loser in this whole embargo thing was not Britain or France, who both did just fine without our trade. It was us. American exports during the period of the embargo from 1807 to 1809 dropped from 109 million to 25 million. So our exports dropped by 75%. Now, you can imagine that this would outrage people because we were no longer selling our crops. The price of our crops failed. That would affect the South, but especially the New England merchants, where I need you to remember, a lot of you got this wrong on the test. Federalists were largely the New England merchant class. Those are the people who made their money off of trade, and those are the people who liked tariffs, because think about it. If you tax the British goods coming in, that makes your own goods that you're going to start to developing more and more appealing because they're going to be cheaper. So this causes a lot of outrage, especially in New England, and they're going to do their time-honored tradition, what they've done since the beginning, even when before the American Revolution, they're going to smuggle. Now, eventually, Jefferson admits that this did not work, that his plan of, well, if we don't trade with the two of them, they'll come crawling back, doesn't work. The analogy here would be, you say, I'm not going to be friends with these two people anymore, and they just both go and get new friends, and you're left alone. That's what happened to America as a result of the Embargo Act. So in Jefferson's defense, he's not prideful. He said, okay, this did not work, and this law gets repealed. This law was passed by Congress. Of course, he couldn't do it himself, but this law gets repealed because it's not working and replaced by a different embargo act where the U.S. is allowed to trade with anyone except France and Great Britain. The Congress states that we will return to trading with them when they start respecting our neutrality and stop threatening our little gummy bear. This image is an interesting one, and I chose it because it really does a good job of showing you what an embargo does. Look at how his hands are encircling and won't allow any trade in or out of Cuba. We, for a long time, had an embargo with Cuba where we attempted to stop them from engaging in any trade. This really is interesting because it's attempting to depict this embargo as evil. Look at his evil nails and his evil red eyes. This is, of course, Uncle Sam, who's attempting to cut off Cuba and not let them trade with anybody. I wanted to remind you of this because you're going to look at some political cartoons when I see you again. So last but certainly not least, we have a domestic or at-home conflict. Both of those were international. This one is going to be domestic. And this gentleman's name is Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh is almost always when we talk about him, Tecumseh and the prophet. His brother is the prophet, and they have a pretty interesting situation going. So two things happened in 1803 that are going to have a huge impact. Ohio is going to become a state, and the Louisiana Purchase is going to become final. So unsurprisingly, Americans are just going to keep relentlessly pushing west. A huge part of your standards is to know the effects on Native Americans. We've talked about these, but here they are again. Diseases like smallpox and influenza are going to kill them off because they don't have natural immunity to them. The clearing of the forest, Americans are pretty gung-ho farmers, so they're going to clear forests in order to have farmland, but that's going to decrease the habitat and eventually kill off important animals like the deer that are crucial to the Native American way of life. Their population is, of course, going to decrease as a result of that disease, and their leadership especially is going to suffer because consider, if you would, that the traditional tribal leaders, consider how woefully unprepared they are for a situation like this. And think about if you have been living under a leader of a tribe your whole life, and suddenly it's shown that he can't protect you. Think even about the attitude that Americans have adopted towards Obama in the face of, thanks Obama, but have adopted in the face of conflict with ISIS. Immediately when you start being afraid and you start being killed off or you start feeling threatened, you start to question your leadership. So this traditional leadership structure starts to suffer, and that's going to affect them too, because without leadership, it's going to be hard for them to unite, which is their only chance to stand up against the Americans. So like I said, here you have Tecumseh. His brother's name is Tenskwatawa. They call him the prophet. The reason they call him the prophet is because his brother, the prophet, is really trying to have a more spiritual would be more accurate. He's trying to unify the Native American tribes spiritually, and he's trying to tackle that element of it. Tecumseh is going to go the military route. Tecumseh is going to go out and look for allies to fight a very military battle. He unfortunately is going to end up getting defeated by a man named William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Tippecanoe River is where that happens. I mention this now only because William Henry Harrison is going to become president pretty much based on this one battle, well, other ones as well, but this battle where he is going to have his slogan be Tippecanoe is going to be his nickname, and he's going to become president largely based on his prowess and his success against the Native Americans. One other thing I would mention, because I didn't put it in here, but you should make sure you know, Great Britain, remember, as a result of the Jay Treaty, had promised they would stop arming Native Americans in the Northwest Territories. They didn't. So when we finally get to go to war with them again in the War of 1812 in Section 4, you will see that that's one of many reasons, in addition to impressment, that we ultimately decide to declare war, is that they keep giving arms to the Native Americans. I will see you in class, and we will analyze a really awesome speech from this man, Tecumseh, so you can see kind of what the Native American attitude was towards what they were doing. I'll see you in class.